This is a PowerPoint presentation about creating PowerPoint presentations. Keep in mind that if in a normal face-to-face class, I would be presenting this to you, and when there's nothing to look at on the screen, you'd be looking at my beautiful face. So bear with that. Also, keep in mind that I'm primarily talking about creating PowerPoint presentations to aid public speaking. And so these concepts don't apply necessarily to creating PowerPoints for, say, a standalone presentation in a kiosk or something like that, but primarily in terms of talking about it in terms of creating face-to-face presentations. So some key concepts we're going to cover in this presentation. One, we're going to talk about content. We're going to also talk about clarity. Third, we're going to talk about accuracy. And fourth, we're going to talk about design. And finally, we'll talk about delivery. So first, let's talk about content. The main thing to keep in mind here is that you should create your PowerPoint presentation. You should create your outline of your presentation before you create the PowerPoint presentation. Don't sit down at PowerPoint and begin creating the content for your speech. Make sure that you're doing that before you actually get to PowerPoint. Sometimes what people will do is they'll end up finding pictures and content to put into their slides, and it doesn't really add anything to their speech, but actually distracts from the audience. This is a good example where a student wanted to talk about nonviolent drug charges. The point was actually about overcrowding in prisons, but it really didn't convey the message that that student wanted to convey. And so what ends up happening when you show a complex picture like this is that people end up thinking about the scenario of the picture that they're looking at rather than focusing on what's being heard and said. And so you do want to make sure that everything that goes into the PowerPoint presentation adds to the presentation itself. Keep in mind that you do not have to show everything you're going to say, but you do have to say everything you're going to show. So everything that goes up on PowerPoint needs some sort of explanation orally from you. Don't expect PowerPoint to drive your organization or to communicate in place of you. It's supposed to be communicating alongside you. So those are some concepts we're going to talk about in terms of content. Now let's talk about clarity. First big concept in terms of clarity is that an image should be self-explanatory. It is absolutely not clear what this presentation slide is about. A second thing is to avoid too much information on the screen. Here's a good example where Andy Mangum once said, "A succinct quotation is a gift." Indeed it is. That slide is simple and it's easy to read. And from a print perspective, it might look like it's got way too little used there. But from an oral perspective, we know that that is absolutely sufficient because they're going to be looking at you as the speaker when they're not reading what's on the screen. Now, a succinct quotation is a gift that can be neutralized by excessive wording consuming most of the slides area, requiring the listeners to choose between listening to the speaker or reading the screen or leaving the audience with the feeling that the speech has been written within PowerPoint. You want to avoid that. You don't have to account for everything that's going to come out of your mouth on PowerPoint. That's how we get the feeling that you're simply clicking through slides rather than actually communicating to us, is when you try to put everything up there. Remember, you don't have to show everything you're going to say, but you have to say everything you're going to show. A third issue with clarity has to do with text over an image background. I'm not a big fan of using images as background, but if you're going to use them, you have to use them effectively. In this situation, you notice that the text gets lost as it moves across the dark background. And so the text on a background image with contrasting light and dark sections can be difficult or impossible to read through. Now, if we lighten up the text, that is a little bit more readable, but still the text gets lost as it moves through the brighter sections. So what I would suggest doing, if you're going to do that, is to consider giving the text box a color or fill that is white, and then set the fill's transparency to 50%. That way we can still see past the image, or rather past the text box, but also have some relief for the text. If you're going to do that, you want to show the image first, and then you want to pull up the slide so that people can see the background image and then the text. Think finally about, in terms of clarity, make sure that you have sufficient text size. for the size of your room. Here's a slide giving an example of how different font sizes look. And if you want to know how this is going to work from your computer screen to the projector screen, my suggestion is that you take about 12 feet distance from your computer screen, depending on the size of your computer screen, and see if you can read it from there. But generally speaking, we want the font size to be large enough to be seen from a good distance. A fifth concept with regard to clarity has to do with getting the labels for graphs and charts as close to what they label as possible. Here's a slide that has too much information on it, and you can see what happens whenever you create a graph within, this is a pie chart rather, pie graph. Whenever you do that within PowerPoint, it creates a legend over to the right. This is actual statistical data about the concern that recent high school graduates have versus current high school graduates. And you can see that recent high school graduates are far more concerned about finances than our current high school students. But your eyes are having to bounce around to get all of that information. To make this a little bit clearer, I usually have to go over to Excel and use Excel's chart producer in order to create charts that have the labels closer to what they actually represent. I've taken out some verbiage so I can explain that, and this makes it a much clearer graph to look at. So whenever we think about clarity, we're thinking about stuff that's self-explanatory, that the labels are close to what they represent, that you're not having to decipher the background from the text itself, and then we want to talk about accuracy. In terms of accuracy, what we're looking at here is making sure that the statistics are not distorted. So if I have that same bit of information, we want to see what happens if I inaccurately depict the statistics graphically. So anyway, here's the same statistics. You can see that on the left we have the anxious teenager representing our current high school students who are concerned about finances, and then on the right our much larger anxious young adult representing the recent high school graduates. Now there is a 17-point increase from high school students who are concerned about finances to graduates who are concerned about finances. So there is a significant shift, but my image on the left is 4 times smaller than my image on the right, and that's misleading, and so that's an inaccurate portrayal of statistics. Another thing we want to think about in terms of accuracy, this is a better example of more accurately portraying. These are statistics of the percentage of people entering college after high school, and you can see how the numbers go up from there. Then now we want to talk about source citation. So you want to cite the source of the information on the slide itself. You can see here that we've got a graphic that I took here from Colin Harmon. And so over in the right bottom hand corner, I have put the source citation. Several years ago, we noticed that students were citing all of their sources on a bibliography slide at the end of their speech, and realized they were doing that because their high school teachers were assigning PowerPoint presentations instead of research papers. But in an oral speech presentation, what we really want is for that source citation to be where it comes in the actual speech itself. So we talked a little bit about clarity, clarifying or accurately portraying statistics and accurately citing our sources. Now let's talk about some design issues that may be effective. Just some couple of reminders. One is to use contrasting colors and also make sure that the size of your text is greater than 28-point font. Another way to make your design a little bit more interesting is by using smart art. And so if you've got a bulleted list, and I'm not a big fan of bulleted lists any more than I am about pictures that are just there to make something pretty, but if you're going to use a bulleted list, you might try the smart art. You create your list, or you actually go to smart art and select it first and then create your bulleted list from within it, and there's lots of different possibilities. But here's an example of Schutz's interpersonal needs theory. The big concepts are are that we have a need for inclusion, affection, and control. And within each of those concepts, there are sub-concepts. So someone who has a less developed need for inclusion is under-social, an a need for too much inclusion or too great a need is called over-socialization. You can see for affection, underpersonal, overpersonal, and in terms of control, abdocrats and autocrats. But we might use smart art to create a little bit more interesting, maybe even a little more clear display of that textual language. So that's just a design feature that you can use there. If you're going to do that, and then when you get to the presentation, you want these items to come up one at a time, what you have to do is select the Smart Art item itself, and then you go to Effect Options, you go to Animations, and you say Entrance Animations. You must select that first, and then it will give you the option of going to Effect Options. Once you're there, you can go down to selecting one by one, and that will pull each of those pictures up, or these squares up one at a time, and so that's a more effective way to do that. Now let's talk about designing images. Again, I'm not a big fan of putting pictures in that don't necessarily convey anything. Your picture should always say something. But if this were a speech where I was talking about where are you going and who are you going with, and I might be using the concept of a train car and who's in the car with you, then this picture might be appropriate to use there. If I was going to do that, then I would, again, want to show the picture, and then I might pull my text in over that. Keep in mind, you're not bound to the squares. You can use other shapes as your text box or your text background. And here I simply stuck my question in there. Where are you going and who are you going with? I've matched colors between the background of the text circle and the bag. Made it transparent so you can still see the guy's face, but provide some relief for that yellow text so that you can see the yellow text. Here's another example of kind of doing the same thing, working within the image itself and overlaying text, not sticking to just a simple square, but actually manipulating your images so that they can work together. Here I might be talking about, are you prepared for the unexpected? I show this cool graphic that I love of the winding road that's all marked with dirt and stuff, and then overlay that with a text box the same shape as the sign, asking the question, are you prepared for the unexpected? So those are some design features that you might think about just to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more ingenious with using PowerPoint. So it's not just the stale, dry way to do that. Some things to avoid when you're designing slides. One very important thing to avoid is be careful of the red-green color combination on a slide. Some people, men more than women, will find the red-green combination when illuminated like this. It will produce headaches and nausea. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that's true of your instructor. I can't look at that very well long. Now let's talk about delivery. In terms of creating your presentation so that it works for your delivery, the most important thing I want you to keep in mind is to include a blank slide whenever you have something to talk about that you don't want to illustrate with a slide. You don't have to account for every part of your speech in a slide. When we have bulleted list after bulleted list, it begins to get fairly dry. Bullets don't kill people, but bulleted lists will bore people to death. You don't have to show everything you're going to say. You have to say everything you're going to show. Be selective about that. But when you don't, when you're just going to talk and you're not going to show something, include a blank slide so that you show that, and then until you're ready for the next slide to begin. You should also check out the video that I've posted called common mistakes that people make with PowerPoint. Make sure you watch that. That does over some of the same material, but also some new concepts and things that you want to avoid. All right, thanks.